Hello, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Yongki Hong, and I am a Senior Associate at Scott Legal PC. Today's webinar will focus on E-2 visa investor requirements and renewal considerations. I will be covering the first half of the presentation, and then our firm's another Senior Associate, Dustin Saldarriaga, will take over for more specific examples and considerations. Before we dive in, let me briefly introduce our firm and go over a few housekeeping items. We are a full-service immigration law firm, and we offer services in a wide range of areas, including E2, O1, TN, L1, H1B, and any types of employment or family-based green card cases. Particularly, we have built very strong reputations for the E2 visa cases. We have processed thousands of E2 visa cases, and many of them were higher risk cases and have worked with the U.S. consular offices all over the world. The one reason for this focus is that our firm was established on E2 visa by our firm's founder, Ian Scott himself. That's why we know a lot about E2 visa world. So at the end of this webinar, we'll send you several useful tools. A copy of the PowerPoint presentation we will go through today, a link where you can download guidelines with more details on visa options, a link to sign up for additional webinars, a link to webinar recording on YouTube. We encourage you to subscribe and hit the notification button as we regularly post immigration-related videos. And a link where you can set up consultation with us. Finally, for any questions, please type them into chat box or Q&A box. We'll address all the questions at the end of presentation. And with that, let's get started. So, E2 visa. What are the requirements for the E2 visa? E2 visa is basically a great visa for entrepreneurs. You have to be a national of a treaty country, and currently United States have signed the treaty agreement with more than 80 countries. The list of E2 countries occasionally change, not that often, like every few years. A few countries would be added or fall off from the list. So you should check the official E2 country list before you actually submit your E2 visa application. But keep in mind that you do not need to be born from the treaty country. You just need to hold a passport from that country. For example, you're born in India, which is not a treaty country with the United States, but later immigrant to Canada and have a Canada passport now, then you are eligible for the E2 visa. And you must own at least 50%, half of the E2 company's ownership. Must be actively participating in the business operations. You cannot be just passive shareholder of the E2 company. The next requirement is that you must make a substantial investment. Then what is a substantial investment? Well, we'll talk about it more detail later, but generally speaking, it means the sufficient amount to make the E2 business fully operational. The fund must be at risk. This means you actually need to spend the money. You cannot claim an investment where you wire transfer the fund and funds are currently sitting in your E2 business corporate bank account. That's not enough to claim that you have invested. The fund must be used before you submit the application. How much investment is enough? We'll discuss more details later on this presentation, but generally speaking, the question you should ask is what kind of business you are starting and what are the reasonable startup costs for the type of business. You also need to prove that investment funds are coming from the legit source. For example, if your funds are from a sale of property, then you will need to submit a signed contract for the property transaction, closing documentation, a bank statement showing the deposit of net proceeds from the transaction. Those documentation will be needed to prove that the funds are coming from the legit source. For this matter, please keep in mind that government wants to see very clear fund flows from the documentation. So you should try very hard to keep it simple and easy for the government officers to understand how funds are originated and came to E2 business account. The business also must be real and operating. What it means is that when you arrive at United States with your valid E2 visa, your business must be able to start from that moment. So basically, you should submit your E2 business application when it is fully ready to operate. So as soon as you come to the United States, you should be able to make incomes from the next day. That's the whole meaning of real and operating. To prove this element is satisfied, you usually need to submit a signed commercial lease agreement. The documentation proves that your business entity has been established and registered. Your E2 business company's website is currently up and running. And maybe some supplement evidence showing that contracts with the customers has been already signed, or you already obtained the necessary license from the state government. There's also marginality requirement. The whole point of E2 business is, if you think about it, is that creating jobs and contributing to the local economy in the United States. So if your E2 business is barely making income just to cover E2 investor and his family members' living cost, that's not really good enough. And that's what marginality requirement test is. So you should make your E2 business should be able to make more incomes to hire U.S. local workers. E2 business also require you have to have an intent to return to your home country upon the expiration of your E2 visa. E2 visa is not a green card or does not automatically lead to a green card. So it only allows you to enter United States for temporary period to develop and run your E2 business. But it does not mean you cannot renew your E2 visa or obtain your US permanent residency. You could renew it, eventually go after US green card. But you should carefully design the case direction with an immigration attorney for the green card cases. So, there are two ways to approach your E2 visa case. One is to start your own business, and second is buying an existing business. The first option is basically you need to do everything from the scratch. You have to register the corporation in the State Department, sign the commercial lease agreement. You need to do many things to have your business up and running. The second option is to buy an existing business. Buying an existing business also has two sub approaches. You can go through sale before E2 visa is approved, which will be riskier option before you already have because in that case you are already own the business, but you are not authorized to run the business yet. So somebody else in the United States need to run the business for you while you are going through the visa application. Another approach option is that you can buy the business through the escrow agreement. This means all the terms and conditions are satisfied except visa approval. So escrow agent will hold the money, purchase price, and once confirmed that your E2 visa is approved, then he will release the fund to the seller. However, if E2 visa application is denied, then money will go back to buyer you. So it gives you more protection and therefore is very attractive option. How long is E2 visa valid? That depends on the treaty agreement between the United States and foreign country. It could be very short, like 3 months, or 5 years. Does it mean that I could run only my business for 3 months? No. If your visa is only 3 months and you come to the United States, but CBP will give you more than 2 years or something like 2 years of duration of a stay. That's different from the visa validity duration and your CBP's authorized duration of a stay in the United States. So regardless of the visa validity duration, you will typically get 2 years of E2 status when you come to United States, so that you can run your business for 2 years. But catch is, once you go out from the United States, you have to reapply and renew your E2 visa again. So you have only 3 months of E2 visa. You can come to the United States. After 1 year, you have some kind of family emergency in your home. So you fly out from the United States. Although you have 1 more year to stay in the United States or United States according to I-94, that 1 more year will be wiped out as soon as you goes out. So please make sure to understand the difference between the visa and status. A visa is more like an admission ticket to the United States, but once you are inside the United States, your authorized duration of stay is not governed by visa, but the CBP's I-94 form will decide the duration. And for the E2 visa, CBP officers usually give only 2 years of duration of stay every time you re-enter United States. So meaning is that even if you have 5 years of E2 visa on your passport, you may need to make international travels at least a couple of times to renew your I-94 duration. So it is very important to check your I-94 every time you enter United States. Move on. So let's talk about how much investment is enough. This is very common question. Please keep in mind that there is no minimum settlable investment amount. In EB5, there's actual minimum investment amount set by the regulations, but that's not the case for the E2 visa. But you have to invest substantial amount of money. And that depends on type of business you are starting and where you are applying, because each consular office post applies a slightly different review standard and overall strength of your case. So the government also uses a proportionality test. What it means is that if the startup cost for a consulting service based business, like for example, is $50,000, then government wants to see that you have spent very high percentage of total invested fund. But if your business, for example, like let's say a pharmaceutical factory, that needs millions and millions of dollars, then you can just invest a lower percentage of total investment fund before you submit the application. So let's say the pharmaceutical factory needs total $5 million, and you have invested only $1 million so far. That's only 20% required over the total required startup cost. compared to the consulting business we just talked about, the consulting business, you invested $50,000, and I said that you probably need to spend most of the money, almost 100%. In this, pharmaceutical factory example, you invested only 20% of the total required startup cost. But government will still agree that you invested substantial amount of money because of a proportionality test. If you are buying a business, you need to consider that whether purchase price you are paying is the fair market value. Please note that government does not like to see a situation where investor is buying a business for unreasonably low price. To demonstrate that purchase price reflects a fair market value, it is often very good idea to obtain third-party business valuation report. I'll give you an example. Let's say a valuation report is showing that the business you are trying to buy is worth around, let's say $100,000. And the contract you negotiate and list is that purchase price is also $100,000. Then you are in very strong position to prove the element of this E2 visa's particular element for the fair market value. You also need to watch out for the seller's financing situation, which is often problematic for the E2 visa. It is because you are not allowed to use the E2 business's assets as a security collateral. For example, if you invest only half of total purchase price and having the other half from the seller's financing, then government usually believes that you have not substantially invested in the business because the seller's financing is secured by E2 business assets. Franchises are also a good option for the E2 visas. It could be either you are buying an existing business or starting new franchise business in a completely new location. This type of arrangement is good to prove that there is a proven business model and promised future incomes based on the franchise's already existing reputations. You also need to think about where you are going to spend the money. There are good and bad expenditures. There are certain expenses that are considered as stronger and some weaker. For example, travel expenses, hotel accommodation fees, your meals, business meeting with the vendors. These types of expenditures are considered weak and actually not recommended bad expenditures. But good ones are purchase of computers, softwares, leasing commercial office space, hiring an employee and paid wage. Those types of expenses are very strong and good, and we recommend it. Sometimes we get a question whether a home office is acceptable, and paying home mortgage is considered as a valid E2 expenditures. We do not recommend a home office based on E2 visa application, although you could make an argument about it, but your business, like for example, your business type does not need a commercial office space, everything run by on the internet. But the government does not usually buy this type of argument. They have been very conservative about these particular issues, so that's why we do not recommend home office settings. Move on, next. Do I have to hire US employees? Answer is yes. Again, think about the whole point of E2 visa, why United States government is giving out this visa, is basically, to create local jobs in the United States. So, if your E2 business is barely making incomes, just cover your own expenses as an E2 investor and your family members, then government doesn't, really believe that your E2 visa is passing the marginality test. They don't like it. So that's why it is very important that your E2 business should create enough incomes to hire local US employees. This means your application should prove that you are not going to operate your business as a solo owner or without any employees. We generally recommend that your business plan shows that you are going to hire at least 4 or 5 full-time employees within 5 years. You could even hire an employee before you apply for the E2 visa, application. Such would actually recommend it and actually strengthen your E2 visa case. Sometimes people ask whether there is a difference between W2 employees and 1099 workers. Generally, it is better to have a W2 employees for your E2 business, but that also depends on the type of business. For example, let's say you are in a construction industry where hiring subcontractors are very common and usual. Then it is probably okay to pay the subcontractors' fees with the 1099 arrangement. But even if so, your construction business, E2 business, should at least have a couple of full-time W2 employees. So the point is, it is not good at all if your E2 business only has 1099 contractors. Keep in mind that. If your business is a new business, you could prove your intention to hire US workers in the future by submitting business plan. If you are buying an existing business, then you will need to submit the existing business's W-2s, pay stubs, tax returns. So you should carefully choose which business you are going to buy. If the business you are going to buy did not have any employees in previous years, only had, for example, a couple of 1099 contractors, then such is not a good candidate for your E2 business because the government will believe that the business has been not able to hiring US workers, so will be more than likely continue their conditions. So that's why that's not a good business to buy for your E2 business. Okay, so with that in mind, let me turn it over to Dustin, who will guide you through the next part of our presentation. So please stay tuned.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Yongki, for the excellent information. So we are going to build off of what Yongki has already shared with you all and talk about the importance of a business plan. So as Yongki mentioned, one of the fundamental requirements for an E2 visa is that the E2 company will employ US workers. We generally recommend between 3 to 5 US employees at a minimum within a 5-year period after starting operations. So where does a business plan fit into this? Well, a business plan is absolutely critical if the business is a startup and does not already have employees. If you are just starting a business, you want to apply before you have employees, which is fine. As Yongki said, you do not need employees at the time you apply. You only need to convince the government that you will have US employees. Then a business plan is going to be essential for you. If your business already has 3 full-time equivalent US workers, then a business plan becomes more optional. And what you would include in your application is proof that you already do have those employees, such as payroll records, W-2 forms, documentation like that. So let's say that you decide that you do want or need a business plan for your application. What would a business plan include? The first and most important thing that needs to be in a business plan is an executive summary. This is typically a page or 2 pages at the beginning of the business plan that really touches on the most important aspects of the business plan. And that is, first of all, what the business is going to sell, its products or services, the business's name, um, how much revenue is projected, the business is projected to generate over a 5-year period, how many employees the business is projected to employ over a 5-year period. Really, those are going to be the key points. And the reason the executive summary is especially critical is because typically officers are not going to read more than the executive summary. If they read any of the business plan at all, frankly. So the business plan, consular officers and USCIS officers tend to be very pressed for time. So when they are reviewing applications, they typically are going to read just the highlights, the most important aspects of an application. So the executive summary is going to be that part. So you really want to make sure that if the officer only reads the executive summary, what information do you want to make sure that they get from that? And what that is, again, fundamentally is going to be how many employees the business is projected to employ and how they're going to get to that number. That's not to say that the business plan should not have other aspects. You do need a complete business plan, even if the officer doesn't get to read it before they consider your application. What may happen is at your interview, they might decide to focus on the business plan and actually go through those other sections, even if they haven't read them before. So what are those other sections? Usually a business plan will include a market analysis that looks at other competitors, what the total number of potential customers is, things like that. A marketing plan that talks about what steps the business is going to take to generate interest in its products or services. A personnel plan. This is really key. The personnel plan is going to show from years 1 through 5 what roles are going to be filled at the company and what their salary is going to be. The personnel plan is also going to show how salaries are going to increase over time, for example, due to inflation. So that is key. Also, a comprehensive financial plan. So the financial plan really is going to show what the projected income and costs of the business are, again, over a 5-year period. The financial plan is also going to talk about the assumptions being made. So when you say that your business is going to generate $400,000 of revenue in year 5, what are the assumptions there? How much are you going to charge for each product? How many customers are you going to need in order to generate that revenue? Things like that. Also, like I said, the financial plan is going to show costs. So these should reflect gradual increases over time, again, due to inflation, or perhaps you need to increase your commercial space. Again, these are all projections. So the officer wants to see that you've thought through how the financial plan, the growth in your sales and your costs, is going to lead naturally to your need for US employees. So the personnel plan and the financial plan really do fit together and should fit together very well. Now, one quick note on the business plan is that these are projections. So the business plan needs to be based on good faith assumptions or guesses. It is okay if you don't hit the benchmarks or the projections that are in your business plan, as long as it was a good faith estimate. That is what matters. It's good faith and it's rooted in reasonable assumptions. But let's say that you just don't hit your targets when it comes time to renew. As long as you can show that your business is generating enough revenue to employ those 3 US workers, you are probably going to be fine at renewal, even if your business plan suggested that you'd be either employing more people or generating more revenue or profit. However, in light of that, my general recommendation is it is better for the business plan to be conservative as long as you're hitting the target 3 US full-time equivalent US workers. As long as you're hitting that in the business plan, it's okay to be conservative. I have worked with clients who will project $20 million in revenue within 5 years and 100 employees. And I may come back to them and say that that is a wonderful projection, but why don't we take a more conservative approach? Maybe lower the projected revenue, maybe lower the projected number of employees, so that when you go to your renewal, the officer is pleasantly surprised that you've surpassed your benchmarks, rather than you needing to explain why you had very, ambitious benchmarks that you didn't hit. So it just creates a better tone for you when you go to renew your visa. So a few additional considerations. Yongki talked about a number of these, so we'll just walk through these again because I do think they're worth emphasizing. The first, should you apply through USCIS or a consulate? Keep in mind, the first question is going to be, where are you physically? If you are outside of the US, your only option is a consulate. So you cannot apply to USCIS if you are not in the US. But if you're inside the US, you do have those two options. You can apply for a change of status to E-2 status, or you can apply at a consulate and travel abroad and get your visa. There are significant pros and cons to each. The most significant con to applying through USCIS is that you don't get a visa. What you get is status. So if you do need to travel, if you plan to enter and exit the US, you want to leave, come back in E-2 status, you need to get a visa at a consulate. What USCIS, if you apply through them, what they're going to do is they're going to give you E-2 status, which will let you work at the E-2 business as long as you're in the US. But the moment you leave the US, you abandon that status, and you're going to have to go to a consulate and get a visa if you want to come back in E-2 status. Um, the Some other pros and cons. USCIS does tend to accept a lower investment amount. So if you don't have a whole lot of money to invest, I'm talking amounts uh, really under $50,000, potentially even lower, and you just don't have the ability to invest more, then USCIS is probably going to be your best bet. Consulates do tend to look for a higher investment amount, although not always. The other thing about USCIS is that they do take a very close look at your source of funds. So they do not have a page limit, and they are going to want to see extensive documentation about where you got the money from that you're investing in the business and every single step that each dollar took from the source all the way to being spent on the company. So that can take a lot of effort. If you don't have good documentation, it could weigh in favor of applying at a consulate. The other question is really, what consulate will you be applying at? As of now, the government is very strict about consulates only accepting applications from people who either reside in their jurisdiction or have a passport from the country where the consulate is located. In the past, there was more flexibility in terms of which consulate you could apply to. So, if you are applying at a consulate that tends to require a very high investment amount, and you are inside the US, that might weigh in favor of applying through USCIS. But anyway, this is really a topic that we do help our clients think through. We apply around the world and at USCIS, so we have a sense of what consulates are looking for and whether your application would be viable depending on which consulate you need to apply to. The second consideration, as I mentioned, I briefly mentioned, is source and trail of funds. This is the requirement that you must prove to the government that your investment funds come from a lawful and a legitimate source. Um, uh, the the negative side of that is that certain consulates like London or like USCIS don't have a page limit, so the documentation here can be extensive. But the benefit of this is that the government does accept a very broad range of sources, as long as they're legal and as long as they are your personal funds, meaning one of the few cases that will not work is if you have already started your US company and it has retained earnings. You can't use those retained earnings because they're not your personal funds. You need to distribute those funds to yourself, and then you can invest them into the business. But that is one of the few sources that is not acceptable. The other source that is not acceptable is a loan that is secured by the E-2 company. So if your business takes out a loan, you cannot include that as the source of funds. Again, the source of funds needs to be your personal fund. So that can include gifts. You can receive a gift from pretty much anyone. As long as they acquired those funds legally and they can document where they got those funds from, you can use a gift to qualify for an E-2 visa. So if you have a very generous parent or sibling that wants to give you funds for your E-2 company and they are willing to provide documentation of where they got the funds, that can work well. Also loans. So you can use loans. You can even use unsecured loans, such as a personal credit card. You, as I mentioned, cannot use a loan secured by the E2 company, though. Some considerations for small investment amounts. Yongki mentioned at the very start of the presentation that we do regularly handle what we call high risk cases. And usually what that means is applications with a low investment amount. Even our firm was started on a very low investment amount. So we are personally and intimately familiar with how you can be approved with a low investment amount. When I say a low investment amount, I do mean under $100,000. Uh, that being said, there are plenty of consulates around the world where an investment of $60,000 or $80,000 is fine. But the reason that I flag $100,000 is at that investment amount or under $100,000, you do need to think about how to strengthen other aspects of the case. So, if you're investing $60,000, for example, it is worth thinking about whether you can hire a US employee before you apply. Because that shows the government that even though you've invested a relatively low amount, you're already generating work for US workers. And at the end of the day, that employment piece is critical to an E-2 visa. I like to say that that employment requirement is a make or break factor in applications. And what I mean by that is if you can convince the government that you will hire US workers, that can outweigh any concerns they have about, for example, a low investment amount. At the same time, though, if you do not convince the government that you'll hire US workers, that could result in a denial in spite of other aspects of the case being very strong. So if you've invested $2 million into a business, but the officer thinks you're not going to employ any US workers, you're very likely to be denied. Conversely, if you've invested $40,000 and you already have a successful business that's employing 3 or 5 US workers, that case is a viable application. So hiring US workers can really be critical. Other ways to strengthen an application with a low investment amount is to include letters of intent, which are letters from prospective clients saying that they're interested in doing business with your company. So by showing that this is a business that is going to be creating a good or a service that the public wants, that can be very persuasive to an officer. Similarly, a CPA letter, so a letter from a certified public accountant, can be very helpful as well if the accountant is willing to say this applicant has invested, $50,000 or $60,000. But in my experience as a CPA, that amount is sufficient to start a business of their type, whether that's a consulting business, a law firm, whatever it is. A CPA letter can be helpful. So the next item on our list, E-2 visas for two investors. As Yongki mentioned, you do need to prove that you own at least 50% of the E2 company in order to qualify as an E2 investor. But what that means is you can have two E2 investors if they each own exactly 50% of the US company. They do both, if they're both applying for an E2 visa, E2 investor visa, they do need to each satisfy the requirements. So they do each need to have an active role at the business. They both need to invest in the business a substantial amount, and they need to have a lawful source of funds. So, but we have plenty of cases where we have helped two investors both get E2 visas. An interesting note on this is that the nationality of the E2 company is determined by the nationality of the investors. So why that's relevant is you can hire E2 employees from the country of the nationality of the business. So if a national of Canada gets an E2 visa and starts a business in the US, other nationals of Canada can apply for an E2 employee visa to work for that company because they have the same nationality. Now, they would need to qualify as a manager or an executive or a specialized employee, but regarding the nationality piece, they would satisfy it by having um, Canadian nationality. When you have two investors, the company has two nationalities. So let's say that Canadian has a co-owner who is German, has a German passport, has an E-2 visa as a national of Germany. The company would be Canadian and German and could hire E-2 employees from either Canada or Germany. A side note is E-2 visas are not available for people who are either US permanent residents or citizens, so US citizens. So if that national of Canada has dual citizenship with the US, they could not apply for an E-2 visa. So an E-2 visa, you become ineligible once you become a permanent resident or get US citizenship. Um, the next item, substantive changes to the business after filing. This really is a complicated area. If you do run into this, I would recommend you schedule a consultation. So what this means is, what if you get an E-2 visa to start a restaurant in the US and business is going okay, but you realize that you would make more money installing internet in people's homes. So you want to start installing internet in people's homes. Um, if you didn't tell the government that your E-2 business is going to be a restaurant and an internet installation business, then you cannot start installing internet in people's homes. So in other words, to make this more broad, your activities in the US need to be limited to the scope of what you state in the E-2 application. So if you do, let's say you are an expert in installing internet and you think, you know what, there's a chance I'll want to do that along with my restaurant, you can make the scope of your business both items. I'm going to start a restaurant and there's going to be this separate component to my business, which is installing internet, helping people with internet solutions. Just make sure if there's a chance you'll be doing that, make the scope of the application broad enough so that it's not considered a substantive change to the business. It actually is what you declared the business would be. Now, part of what makes this a bit of a gray area, as I mentioned before, is that there you can think about how there are certain businesses that are related. So let's say that our E-2 applicant is running their business, their restaurant in the US, and they decide to open a coffee shop. Well, a coffee shop is related to a restaurant, arguably, so it's probably fine for them to start a coffee shop along with the restaurant, as long as they're both within the same, corporation or LLC, the E-2 company. That is probably fine. Um, to make a related point, when you get an E-2 visa, you have work authorization to only work for the E-2 company. And that is going to be, when I say the E-2 company, that is going to be a limited liability company, an LLC, or typically a corporation in the US. That is the company that's going to issue W-2s to your employees. It's going to receive income from your business activities. It's going to pay you as the owner. So that is the only entity you can work for. So if you want to start working, you want to change the scope of your business, say you want to start that coffee shop along with the restaurant, it needs to be within the same business entity. If you start a new LLC or a new corporation and you start working for that company, you very likely have violated your work authorization because, again, your work authorization is limited to the E-2 company itself, the legal entity, that business. Now, we help people navigate these questions all the time. It is possible to have a management services agreement and to contract yourself out. That can be done, but it is complicated. So reach out to us if you want to do that. Finally, there are some higher risk cases, like just the nature of the business is higher risk. A few of these examples are real estate investment companies, equity trading companies, or family business purchases. So let's talk about those first two categories first. Real estate investment companies, or real estate companies generally, and equity trading companies are high risk because the government tends to assume from the start that these types of businesses don't require US employees. So if you do want to start a business that is either a real estate business or an equity trading business, you need to make sure your application makes it clear why you will need to hire US employees. And if you can hire US employees before you apply, that's going to be a great thing. Um, I'll also just say, real estate businesses, I think they get unfair treatment by the government. Because, for example, if you do have a company that clearly requires workers, then a real estate company can be fine. But the government tends to see real estate companies and think that you're buying property, and maybe developing the property a little bit, but really waiting for that property to appreciate and selling it. And that's not going to require workers. If you're doing, for example, house flipping, make sure you have a number of houses. That's going to require actual employees, versus, say, a home or two where you'll hire a contractor or two to do work. That's not going to be approved. Equity trading is similar because the idea is you're going to start a company, buy stocks, wait for those stocks to appreciate, sell the stocks, whatever it is. The government is going to assume, if you're doing equity trading, that you don't need employees. So show them that you do need employees if you're going to go this route, but ideally don't go that route, because those companies are higher risk. Family business purchases. The reason these are higher risk is, the government wants to know, as Yongki said before, that you've made a substantial investment in the business. And if you have bought a business from a family member, the government is going to question whether you made a substantial investment because they may assume you got a discount, you got a preferential rate. So if you're buying a business from a family member, make sure that you have a valuation showing that you're paying the fair market value for the business and that there is an objective um, measure, for the amount that you're paying. So family business purchases can definitely work. You just want to bolster them with evidence that the amount you're paying is the reasonable amount. So some common reasons for E-2 visa denials. People will uh, come to our firm after being denied, and we will look at what was submitted, whether that was submitted by them individually or by their previous lawyer. Um, and we've learned a number of lessons, in terms of common reasons for denials. The first is the investment amount is simply low. So if you are investing, again, under $100,000, and you don't have employees, the application's not strengthened elsewhere, this can commonly result in a denial, especially if you're applying at a consulate that looks for a higher investment amount. Second, the nature of the business. As I mentioned before, real estate companies, equity trading, those are innately risky businesses. So if you're applying with that type of company, you may face a denial. Let me quickly go back to low investment amount, because I do want to make another point. Another thing that I see, with some frequency, is that people will, as Yonki mentioned, people will put money into the business bank account and not spend it, or will spend a little bit of it. So they'll spend, $10,000, $15,000, and then they'll have $50,000 as working capital. That is probably not going to work. The government wants to see that you've spent the money. So working capital is not going to be sufficient to meet the investment requirement. On the other hand, if you have spent, $50,000, $60,000 and you have 20,000 in working capital, you can include that 20,000 to show you have a total investment of, 70, 80,000, but don't rely on the working capital. In other words, there is no substitute for spending the money on the business. The third common reason for an E-2 denial is the filing location or the venue. I mentioned before that certain consulates do look for larger investment amounts. There are consulates that see many, many, many E-2 applications from large companies. So when they get an application from someone who has a startup, and an investment of 80,000 or 100,000, they immediately take a skeptical look. So you may just be in a location with a more challenging consulate. Um, uh, some consulates are more familiar with the E-2 requirements than others. We have filed at consulates where there is no E-2 treaty with the host country. Just as an example, we have filed for a UK national in Vietnam. And so Vietnam does not have an E2 treaty. So we had to educate the consulate on what an E2 visa is, what the E2 treaty is, and that the applicant, because they're a national of the UK, they do qualify. That can work for you or against you, depending on where you are filing. Um, Another common reason for a denial is that the applicant has a business in the home country that does not have employees. And the reason this can result in a denial is because the consulate may be skeptical that the US business will create jobs for US workers. This isn't hard to imagine. So let's say you want to start a consulting business in the US and it's a startup and you've run a consulting business in Canada for 2 decades and only employed yourself and your spouse, that's going to be a problem. The consular officer is going to ask, well, why should I believe that your company in the US, which is doing the same thing, is going to create jobs when the business in Canada didn't create jobs? You're going to have to overcome that. So um, that can be a common issue. So how to overcome that? Hire US workers before you apply. That's going to be the easiest way to overcome that. Next, issues with the adjudicating officer. So at the end of the day, for better or for worse, the consular officer or the USCIS officer basically has complete discretion over whether to approve or deny your application. Consular decisions cannot be appealed. You cannot sue the consulate. You can, it'll be dismissed because of Supreme Court precedent. But what that means is that, if you get an officer who's having a bad day, unfortunately, that could mean you're going to be denied, even if you have a strong application. The positive side, though, is that you can reapply. And if you do reapply, most consulates will assign you to a new officer. So usually this is not going to be the end of the road for someone. They will usually learn why the application was denied and typically will apply again. The next reason is that the applicant did not meet the requirements at the time of filing. So people do come to us at times and we'll look at the application they filed and we'll see they just didn't qualify. They might have applied with a passport that doesn't have E2 treaty country nationality. Um, uh, they might not have made the business real and operating at the time they applied, so or ready to be real and operating, a variety of reasons. So working with an immigration lawyer can help. And what does it take to renew an E2 visa? So first on the list, I know I'm repeating this, hire US workers. That's really key. You want to have at least 3 to 5 US employees within a 5-year period, within 5 years of starting operations. When you apply to renew, you will include tax returns showing how the business has been doing. Hopefully, you'll show that the business is profitable and making enough to pay you as the investor and your family. Include payroll information showing that you're employing workers. If the company's not doing well, do try to hire at least an employee before you apply to renew. If you're at year 4, year 5, you're going to renew and you don't have any employees, that is going to be a tough application to get approved. So hire an employee. Even that's going to be difficult to get approved, but it does improve your chances. Next, make sure that the company still meets the E2 requirements. You always want to maintain at least 50% ownership as the E2 investor. If you're selling equity, just make sure you have that 50%. It's okay if your equity changes as long as it's always above 50% or equal to 50%. The moment your ownership share drops below 50%, you immediately lose eligibility for an E2 investor visa. So this is critical. Changes to the business. I mentioned substantive changes before. So just make sure that you're only performing the services, selling the products that you say you're going to in the initial E2 application. If you look to change your business, talk with an attorney beforehand to see if it's a related business. And if it's not related, you can seek approval from USCIS to basically amend your E2 status. A few developments and adjudication trends over the last couple years. We do see, and government data shows that E2 visas do have high approval rates. So across the board, because they tend to be approved about 80 to 90% of the time. Our approval rate is in the very high 90s, though I must say past performance does not predict or guarantee future outcomes, but we do see very high approval rates on E2 visas. Recently, the second item you see investment purchases in the US. Consular officers are more and more wanting to see that at least half of the investment in the E2 company was spent on items, inventory, equipment purchased in the US. So if you have invested $100,000 into your US company and you sell products on Amazon, um, be sure not to spend all of those funds on inventory in China. Try to limit the expenditures outside the US to 50% of your investment, and then the rest try to dedicate to things you're buying in the US. The best expenditure is paying US workers. So if you can hire a worker, put them on payroll, that is ideal. And I've mentioned that a few times. I just want to make clear this is very feasible and people do it all the time, even if they're not in the US. You can start a business in the US. You can hire a manager or an employee remotely, maybe have them work on marketing, maybe have them do some administrative tasks. It doesn't really matter what the role is as long as it's needed by the company. And it doesn't really matter what you're paying them or if they're even working an hour or two a week. Just having someone on payroll really can improve an application. On that note, hiring of US citizens. Has become more important under the Trump administration. So there are times when consular officers will want to ask, why do you need to come to the U.S. to do this? Can't a U.S. citizen do this? And we will help prepare our clients for questions like this. And as a business owner, you are creating jobs, so this really shouldn't be an issue. It does come up sometimes if you're applying for an E2 employee visa, so that is important to anticipate. Try to hire employees rather than contractors. Contractors can be okay, but employees are generally better. Um, uh, Administrative processing. Unfortunately, there are times when you'll apply and the government will basically do additional security screening on your application. That can take months. It can take days or months. It really is a black hole. It's oftentimes impossible to know what what they're looking for and how long the process will take. You can continuously follow up with the consulate and ask, but the positive side of this is that long administrative processing delays are still rare. So don't worry about it. But if it does happen to you, it is just a matter of being patient and waiting. We are seeing more USCIS filings. This was an uptick that happened really under COVID when travel became more difficult and people wanted to remain in the US. There are longer waits at consulates, although we um, we are we have recovered from the long delays during the pandemic, which were just really, really long delays. Now, the delays are more reasonable, kind of the 3-month mark to 6-month mark for most consulates. All right, I know we do have a couple questions that came in. Um, let's start with the first, substantiality in particular. For a business plan in building a fintech financial technology service, which would involve large capital funding, would need time to build out the business in phases. How do I interpret the amount of investment required? Given the capital requirement is substantial, I would rely on some sort of loan to build out the business, or should I build my business plan based on the initial phases? I think you hit it on the head with that latter part. I think the best approach here is to focus the business plan based on the initial phases. Again, the business plan is looking at 5 years, and it is okay to take a conservative approach on the business plan. So if you have very big hopes and plans for the business over the next decade, or even the 5 years, you can focus the business plan on what is feasible given your investment. And the substantial investment requirement is the startup cost. So it is the investment that's required to get the business operational, not to take the business to what you hope it will be someday. So I do hope that helps. I do think this would be helpful over a more extensive consultation. So feel free to schedule a consultation. One thing I will flag here, though, is if you do plan to sell equity, be really careful to maintain your 50% ownership. It sounds like this might be what you have in mind. So just maintain that 50% ownership. What are the chances of approval if the business we are investing in is showing loss but doing well overall? Tricky question. We would need to talk through the specifics of exactly what you have in mind. If you're buying a business that is not generating enough profit to support you and your family, in addition to the employees, that is going to be risky. The government wants to see that you have a business that's going to support you and your family. It's okay if you are starting a business that in year one, possibly even year two of the business's existence is showing a loss and you show a recovery in the business plan, that could be okay. But if you are buying a business, and I don't know if you're buying a business, but if you are buying a business that is showing a loss, that's going to be risky if that business has been operational for a few years because the government's going to want to know what you're going to do to turn it around. You're starting from a defensive position rather than a position of strength. Um, so I always do say if you're looking at buying a business, buy a business that already has 3 US employees and is generating enough profit to support you and your family. That really is the safest and most secure way to go. All right, great questions. Okay, it's 11. We have one a couple more quick questions I'll quickly get through. The current owner is taking higher salary. We schedule a consultation. We can talk about that. I mean, again, do you want to be in the position of explaining this to a government official or starting with a business that you can say, from a position of strength, as you can see from the documentation alone, this is going to be a business that will succeed and will hire US workers. It may very well be able to be approved, but you know, better to start from a position of strength. Can we stay in the US while our case is filed at the consulate, not USCIS, while waiting for the interview? Great question. If you are in the US on a valid visa, you can stay in the US as long as you don't overstay your I-94 and as long as you don't start working for the company before you have work authorization to. So, for example, if you are on an F1 student visa, you start a business on OPT, and you file an E-2 visa application at the consulate in Toronto, and Toronto is taking months. You can stay in the US on your F1 visa as long as it's still valid and work on the business as long as your OPT allows you to do that. Or if you're here on a business visitor visa to sign the lease and you file the application in Toronto, you can stay until the expiration of your I-94. Again, make sure you don't start working without authorization. That would be a big problem. But if you have employees in the US who are working, that's fine. If they're doing the work, or if your business is not operational, that's going to be fine for you to stay in the US as long as your I-94 is valid. All right, that's all we have time for. Thank you for the great questions, Yongki. Thank you
Thank you.
for wonderful information you shared as well. Please schedule a consultation if you have any questions at all. We do hope to talk with you soon, and stay well in the meantime.
Thank you.